I love the hush that comes over the crowd. It's a feeling of power. Thank you all for being here this evening. I have a few brief announcements before we bring out our director to introduce our special guest this evening. First of all, if you look at the back of your program we still have some incredibly great programs coming up this semester. Ryan Sager is a brand new addition to our program, our schedule. He's coming on Wednesday the 29th. He's written a wonderful new book called The Elephant: Evangelicals, Libertarians, and the Battle to Control the Republican Party. And he also will do a book signing afterwards, so please come to that. He's, as I said, just a very last-minute addition. We couldn't turn down that opportunity. And we're very excited to have Mark Halperin, the political director for ABC News, and also an author of a brand new book called The Way to Win, Taking the White House in 2008. You will note that also we've got our next White Glove Tour coming up on December 9th. For any of you who've not been through the archives here, that's a great tour to take. A couple of quick announcements. First of all, our question and answer policy. If you've not been here before and not heard this, and Bill, as I always say, is so much better at this than I am. He asks that people don't filibuster. I put it in the terms of we have about a 10-second attention span, about double that if it's a compliment. So if you would wait for the microphone to come to you so we can hear you and so we can get it on tape too. We do tape this for our streaming video. We'll have a couple people with wireless mics, and just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. And afterwards, after this program this evening, our guest will do a book signing at the front. Remember, it is the holiday season coming up, a wonderful time for books. So without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful director of the Dole Institute of Politics, Mr. Bill Lacey, to introduce our special guest.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank all of you for being with us tonight. A little sad note at the beginning. One of America's great economists passed away today. Milton Friedman died at the age of 94. He was a 76 Nobel Peace Prize winner in economics. He had a lot of impact on a lot of free market thinking by individuals, including myself and probably many of you. And I just thought I would mention that. He coined the phrase, "There's no such thing as a free lunch," which is an interesting comment on economics and society. Some attribute last week's Democratic takeover of the Senate and the House to the war in Iraq, and I think that that's in large part true. But there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that the Republican Party's failure to do what it was elected to do was really the driving force in the outcome. This analysis suggests that instead of being limited government conservatives, Republicans became enamored of big government. Instead of being reformers, Republicans took over and became corrupt. Which brings us to the future of the GOP. As George Will put it recently, the country remains receptive to conservatism. That doctrine, were it to become constraining on rather than merely avowed by congressional Republicans, can be their bridge back from the wilderness. We'll see if the House Republicans get it tomorrow when they vote on their party leadership, and see if they vote for a change of leadership that indicates that direction. In many ways, this is still Ronald Reagan's America. A recent CNN poll just before the election showed that by a 54 to 37% margin, Americans think the government tries to do too much rather than too little. Yet the Reagan coalition is fraying, and a feud may loom between the Reagan-Goldwater conservatives and the religious right. Tonight's program looks at that possibility from an intellectual rather than a purely political perspective. Dr. Darryl Hart is the Director for Partnered Projects at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. ISI can best be described, I think, as a disseminator of traditional conservative free market thought focusing on students. I remember discovering ISI when I was a student at Vanderbilt University. It was really quite delightful to find that you could order all of these incredible publications, classical work on politics, and you didn't have to pay for it if you were a student. And they would send you all of this information and you could read it. So they do a wonderful job, and they are co-sponsors along with Alethea of tonight's program. Darryl, like I said, is the Director for Partnered Projects there. He previously was Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor of Church History at Westminster Theological Seminary, and he also directed the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals and taught history at Wheaton College. He's the author of many books, including one that he will be we'll be selling tonight, and he'll be signing after his lecture. It's titled A Secular Faith: Why Christianity Supports the Separation of Church and State. Please welcome Professor Darryl Hart.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I guess there is no free lunch, but there are free books at ISI at least. It's also nice to be here in Kansas. My first time spending much time here, and I've driven past or through Kansas on Route 70 a couple times, I think, and noted there that Arlen Specter and Bob Dole both come from the same town in Kansas. I wish that Dole had moved to Pennsylvania instead of Specter, but that's another story. For over 25 years, an axiom of American politics was that evangelical Protestantism was politically conservative. The notion was not without its illogic, since it assumed that conservative religion and conservative politics went hand in hand. The problem with this logic for evangelicalism was that conservatism in religion, prior to 1970 at least, meant that born-again Protestantism was an otherworldly faith that was more concerned with saving souls for the world to come than with turning out voters to decide on matters of the here and now. This is why evangelicals prior to the Reagan Revolution had the reputation for being quietists, that is, people who were chiefly passive regarding the policies governing the United States. I say reputation because my hunch is that most evangelicals, like my parents, cared about their nation and voted. They simply lacked religious or political leaders who would rally them as an electoral bloc. Yet despite these challenges to contemporary assumptions about religion and politics, evangelicalism has, since at least the founding of the moral majority in 1979, become synonymous with conservatism. From polling data to assumptions about the coherence of politics and religion, born-again Protestantism in the minds of journalists, pundits, and scholars is a powerful constituency without which American conservatism could not have become as dominant as it has been since the election of Ronald Reagan. In point of fact, this axiom of the post-Reagan era of American politics is looking more and more like a hypothesis or even a hope than apodictic truth. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and James Dobson are still in charge of their parachurch fiefdoms and capable of marshaling large numbers of supporters for the Republican Party. But these evangelical leaders are old, and the ones who are likely to fill the vacuum once these figures retire from public life are not nearly so eager to support the GOP or its brand of political conservatism. Indeed, a seldom noticed transition is currently underway in which the born-again greatest generation is giving way to evangelical boomers like myself, every bit as fickle and flaky as their secular Roman Catholic or mainline Protestant counterparts. This generational succession suggests that the days of goodwill and harmonious relations between evangelicalism and American conservatism are coming to an end. Whether the final break will be on the order of an ugly divorce or simply a mutually agreed upon decision to just be friends, the emerging tensions between evangelicals and the right in American politics suggest that we are witnessing their last dance. The results of the 2006 midterm elections could very well be early signs of a more permanent realignment. What I want to do this evening is back up this claim that tension is growing between evangelical Protestantism in the United States and American conservatism. The red state, blue state analysis of the last several presidential contests has obscured the degree to which evangelicalism is an unreliable ally in the conservative constituency. Obviously, many evangelicals in the pews vote consistently for the GOP, but their reasons for doing so are increasingly wearing thin. The reason is that many of the religious convictions that motivate born-again Protestants are at odds with the premises of American conservatism. This is not to say that the Republican Party itself is the arbiter of conservatism properly understood. In fact, the close identification of American conservatism with the Republican Party has posed important difficulties for the conservative supposition articulated over a half-century ago by thinkers like Russell Kirk that culture is more important than politics. Consequently, I don't want to give the impression that the GOP is synonymous with conservatism in the United States. But the recent writings and declarations of various evangelical authors and institutions that express ambivalence about Republican politics is, I believe, indicative of a deeper uncertainty about first-order considerations about human autonomy, legitimate authority, cultural restraint, and the best conditions for human flourishing. After documenting the shift among evangelicals from conservative to more liberal or humanitarian sentiments, I want to try to account for this trend by explaining the religious roots of evangelical, moral, and social idealism. And before concluding, I hope to offer some reflections on what these developments might mean for the future of the religious right. Evangelicalism's problematic relationship to conservatism has been evident for some time, even if the Reagan coalition tried to paper over the difficulty. One way to illustrate this point is to examine the landmark history of a modern American conservatism. George Nash's The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945, a book originally written as a Harvard University dissertation, first published in 1976 and recently reissued by ISI Books. Judging a book by its index is surely a dangerous enterprise, but nonetheless revealing for certain purposes. Glancing through Nash's index yields no trouble in finding such luminaries of American conservatism as Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley Jr., Frederick Hayek, Frank S. Meyer, Brent Bozell, and Wilmore Kendall. Much more harder to find, however, impossible in fact, is a reference to any evangelical in the post-World War II movement that gave us Fuller Seminary, Christianity Today, and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. This may have been an oversight by Nash, an indication that he may have been defining modern conservatism too narrowly or was ignorant of the born-again Protestant world. But by the time the second edition of Nash's book came out in 1996, I believe, which featured an epilogue in which the author attempted to account for conservative developments since the Reagan Revolution, evangelicalism was still a virtual no-show. Nash did devote one page to the religious right and conceded that its concerns were closest to the traditionalist conservatives like Kirk and Richard Weaver. But he also identified an important difficulty that would take some time to play out. Whereas the traditionalists of the 1940s and 1950s had largely been academics in revolt against secularized mass society, Nash explained, the religious right was a revolt by the masses against the secular virus and its aggressive carriers in the nation's elites, end of quote. Unlike traditionalists, then, evangelicals were conservatives who were incapable of spotting structural problems of mass society that contributed to national woes like abortion and pornography. The religious right, unlike the traditionalist right, was not essentially critical of modernity since, as a mass movement, it depended for its very well-being on modern forms of social organization, such as the electronic media, social dislocation, and economic and political centralization. Evangelicals could readily identify specific evils, but had no way to account for the structures that might make such evils plausible, especially if evangelicals themselves depended spiritually on those very structures. During the Cold War, this difference was hard to discern, and once the sexual revolution of the 1960s occurred, even harder to mention. Nash admits, for instance, that leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson generally shared the foreign policy and economic perspectives of other conservatives, even if their guiding preoccupation lay in the sphere of social morality. This was not only true for the religious right, figures from the Reagan coalition, but also for the evangelical leaders just after World War II, to which I now turn. For 25 years after World War II, before Republican strategists and pollsters discovered the potential of the born-again electorate, evangelical ideas on politics were predictably right of center. In his survey of evangelical politics during these decades, the University of Wisconsin political scientist Robert Booth Fowler concluded that born-again Protestant leaders spoke and wrote mainly in defense of free markets, balanced budgets, and common standards of public decency, and also opposed communism as well as domestic policies that might increase the centralization of America's federal government. The defense of freedom was so strong that many evangelical leaders believed even labor unions were incompatible with a liberal society because they impeded free markets. Yet evangelicals were not sanguine about the prospects of the United States. Although they regularly invoked the idea of America's God-blessed status, evangelical spokesmen believed that materialism and hedonism were rapidly dissolving the nation's greatness. In keeping with these general political instincts, evangelical leaders were also suspicious of social action. On the one hand, progressive reforms threatened to increase the power of government and destroy liberty. On the other hand, tinkering with policy and legislation obscured the fundamental problem of human sin, which could only be remedied through faith. For this reason, mainstream evangelical leaders insisted that the church should not be distracted from its primary mission of evangelism to engage in or advocate various social measures. Individual leaders like Carl Henry or Billy Graham might occasionally make assertions that revealed some discomfort with being predictably conservative. The former, Henry, who was the founding editor of Christianity Today, for example, faulted born-again Protestantism for being politically passive and argued that social concerns, a rather ill-defined idea, was an indispensable element of Christianity. In doing so, Henry may have unwittingly unleashed the religious right's later efforts to trace Republican policy back to Christian teaching. Graham also generally towed a conservative line, but during the 1960s, when he sensed that race was harming the effectiveness of his crusades, the evangelist courageously backed civil rights legislation that was, however, clearly at odds with conservative fears about the size of federal government and the relationship between centralized and local authority. Even so, if figures like Henry and Graham were not doctrinaire about conservatism, they were generally advocates of small government and of the ability of mediating institutions such as families, schools, neighborhoods, and churches to supply the moral order for a free society. Not every evangelical was happy with the political orientation of born-again Protestantism. Richard Perard, a historian at Indiana State, and David Moberg, a sociologist at Marquette University, were evangelical academics who wrote books that were especially critical of evangelicals' predictable support for the Republican Party during the 1960s. The title of Moberg's The Great Reversal, Evangelism versus Social Reform, summarized well his point that evangelicals in the 19th century had been much more activist than they were as part of Nixon's silent majority, and that they needed to return to an older pattern of public engagement that did not divorce evangelism from social reform. Perard's The Unequal Yoke expressed the author's complaint that evangelicals were merely handmaidens of the far right. Perhaps inspired by evangelical dissent like this from the evangelical Republican consensus, several younger evangelical academics and leaders assembled in Chicago for a small conference over Thanksgiving weekend in 1973 to issue the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. Some students of evangelicalism argue that this statement signaled a radical shift within the evangelical movement from endeavoring to keep religion and politics separate to the conviction that, as the Declaration put it, social justice is one of the central callings of all Christians. Although this statement was as much an expression of embarrassment over the politics that accompany bourgeois life as it was an affirmation of evangelical convictions, its most important and longest paragraph was an assertion of ideals that revealed evangelicalism could as easily wind up in the ranks of the left as of the right. These evangelicals declared, and I quote, "Although the Lord calls us to defend the social and economic rights of the poor and oppressed, we have mostly remained silent. We deplore the historic involvement of the church in America with racism and the conspicuous responsibility of the evangelical community for perpetuating the personal attitudes and institutional structures that have divided the body of Christ along color lines. Further, we have failed to condemn the exploitation of racism at home and abroad by our economic system." End of quote. By the end of the 1970s, most evangelicals seldom paid attention to the sort of sentiments articulated in this Chicago Declaration. One important reason was communism and the Cold War. As long as the Soviet Union remained a threat, not simply geopolitically, but also as an ideology at odds with America's unique blend of liberal democracy and civil religion, rank-and-file evangelicals could see readily the importance for a strong military and free markets, observations that, despite all the talk about family values, clearly inform such religious right organizations as the Moral Majority, founded in 1979, and the Christian Coalition, begun in 1986. In effect, communism, the glue that held traditionalists and libertarians together in the post-World War II conservative movement, also restrained evangelicalism's sentimental humanitarianism. The threat that communism posed to the United States prevented the evangelical left from ever receiving sustained attention, and instead made sense of the political reflection popularized by Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and James Dobson. But in the light of recent developments, the Chicago Declaration may have been far more important for the future of evangelical politics than the Reagan and Bush eras suggest. For instance, try to find a current book by a recognizable evangelical author expressing some aspect of the case that the religious right has been making over the last 25 years about family values or the need for religious ideals in public life, and you'll have a hard time. Not since Ralph Reed's Active Faith has a mainstream publisher brought out a book from an evangelical with Republican leanings, and that was almost 10 years ago. The lone exception to this assertion is Marvin Olasky's Compassionate Conservatism, which is not only responsible for some of George Bush's faith-based initiative policy, but may also be criticized for tempting conservatives to be more concerned with whether or not they are being perceived as caring and sensitive than with the legitimate functions of government and the social capital that nurture a free and ordered society. Instead, the contemporary crop of evangelical writing on politics are left of center on the political spectrum and outspokenly critical of the religious right. These include Jim Wallis, the author of The Soul of Politics, Beyond the Religious Right and the Secular Left, 1995, and more recently, God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, 2006. Titles that leave little mystery about Wallis's attitude toward the evangelical right. Along with Gregory Boyd, who recently wrote The Myth of a Christian Nation, How Political Power is Destroying the Church, and Randall Balmer's Thy Kingdom Come, How the Religious Right Distorts the Faith and Threatens America, and Evangelicals Lament. It is hard to resist some comment on Balmer's trifecta of a title, adding not just one but two subtitles to the second petition of the Lord's Prayer, as if the phrase "An Evangelical's Lament" was necessary for a book that reads like one of the prophets of the Old Testament. What is striking about these recent titles, aside from the failure of the religious right to counter them in any effective way, is their indication of a trend. Increasingly, the proclivity of evangelical intellectuals is to create space between themselves and the evangelical wing of the Republican Party. Some of the reasons for this are salutary, such as that using Christianity for political purposes can distort significantly the teachings of Protestants, Roman Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox. But the concern to rescue Christianity from its democratic despisers is not very far removed in the pages of these books from real sympathy for left-wing politics. As much as the desire to keep Christianity from being sullied by politics ends up actually as such, the desire to keep Christianity from being sullied by politics ends up actually being a case for Christianity as a faith that supports the Democratic Party's mix of fondness for the welfare state and hostility to bourgeois culture. So much for maintaining the apolitical purity of the Christian religion. The evangelical drift to the political left is broader than the occasional writings of a few born-again opinion shapers. The recent statement by the National Association of Evangelicals for the Health of the Nation, an evangelical call to civic responsibility, issued in 2005, demonstrated that the evangelical rank and file was growing tired of the older constellation of convictions about free markets, limited government, and strong national defense. Since its founding in 1942, the NAE had maintained an office in Washington, D.C., the purpose of which was initially to coordinate relations with the federal government for member denominations when seeking the proper documentation for foreign missionaries, military chaplains, and religious broadcasting. Over time, the Washington staff added lobbying the federal government to its duties. During the first 2 decades, the NAE issued statements that were generally designed to preserve Protestant hegemony in the United States by insisting on the separation of church and state so that government funding would not go to Roman Catholic schools and hospitals. In 1951, the association also endorsed a Christian amendment to the Constitution that would have recognized the authority and law of Jesus Christ, while also holding that no ecclesiastical organization would receive official recognition by the government. Other statements from the Washington office revealed evangelicals' opposition to communism and to the age-old Protestant bogies of secularism and materialism. During the 1970s, Watergate and the Vietnam War provoked the NAE to be more critical of American power, while also warming up its voice on the environment and poverty. But by the Reagan era, religious liberty and human rights provided the rationale for opposing the tyranny of communism and third world dictators. During the 1990s, the NAE also worked with the Clinton administration and Congress to craft the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Not until George Bush's election in 2000 and his faith-based initiative did the NAE adopt a social agenda comparable to the 1973 Chicago Declaration of the Evangelical Left. For the Health of the Nation was a much lengthier statement than the 1973 Declaration. Part of the reason involved an attempt to craft an evangelical approach to public policy. The specific policy initiatives included religious liberty, families, the sanctity of human life, and human rights. 3 new policies also made the cut: justice and compassion for the poor, the environment, and the restraint of violence. By no means radical, this last set of topics was several steps removed from the laissez-faire, anti-communist strain of republicanism that dominated evangelical politics during the 3 decades after World War II. Furthermore, the resemblance between the ideals of the Chicago Declaration and the 2005 NAE statement were not accidental, since Ron Sider had a hand in both statements. That an Anabaptist with a pronounced pacifist convictions emerged as a substantial influence on evangelical politics is a revealing development seldom acknowledged by students of born-again Protestantism. One of Sider's influences was the theme of justice, so important that it could function as a verb. Quote, "Because we have been called to do justice to our neighbors," the Declaration affirms, "we foster a free press, participate in open debate, vote, and hold public office. When Christians do justice, it speaks loudly about God and demonstrates to non-believers how the Christian vision can contribute to the common good and help alleviate the ills of society," end of quote. The theme of justice was also evident in the NAE's statement on poverty, preferring to address the question through the language of a just society rather than through the lens of charity or welfare. The scope of the NAE's proposal was as ambitious as it was, in the language of an older evangelical generation, utopian. Economic justice required a restoration of wholeness in community. As such, the statement urged Christians to become involved in politics in order to shape wise laws pertaining to the creation of wealth, wages, education, taxation, immigration, health care, and social welfare that will protect those trapped in poverty and empower the poor to improve their circumstances. The restoration of wholeness did not stop at the borders of the United States, however. Quote, "We should try to persuade our leaders to change patterns of trade that harm the poor and to make the reduction of global poverty a central concern of American foreign policy," end of quote. For the Health of the Nation was a moderate statement that tried to steer between the shibboleths of the left and the right while still acknowledging the importance of individual responsibility and the transforming power of conversion, both for personal and social reformation. Even so, the NAE's declaration echoed the same sort of logic that had dominated American Protestantism a century earlier during the heyday of the social gospel. Significant social change required personal conversion and institutional renewal and reform. But the statement also revealed a dramatic shift within post-World War II evangelicalism over the church's involvement with national politics. The greatest indication of change was the abandonment of the conviction that churches should stay out of politics and stick to the business of soul winning. It is in a paragraph describing the kingdom of God, which would be characterized by justice, peace, forgiveness, restoration, and healing. The declaration added, "We know that we must wait for God to bring about the fullness of the kingdom at Christ's return. But in this interim, the Lord calls the church to speak prophetically to society and work for the renewal and reform of its structures." End of quote. This was a tall order, but thanks to the logic of compassion, politics and social reform had become for evangelicals as much the Lord's work as evangelism and worship. Other examples of born-again Protestants' left-of-center political instinct deserve comment, but in the time remaining, I want to attempt to account for this leftward drift. Is the problem simply a failure of nerve? Is it, as I have argued, what happened to evangelicals without the concentration of mind that communism supplied? Or could it be that evangelicalism historically has been beset by religious instincts that generally run away from what Russell Kirk called conservatism of thought and imagination? Wilfred McClay identified a tension between evangelicalism and conservatism in a talk he gave at the Ethics and Public Policy Center a few years ago. He was trying to account, specifically for George Bush's conservatism and the influence of evangelicalism on his policies and understanding of the United States. According to McClay, Bush's evangelical Protestantism has broadened and softened the president's younger tendencies toward hard-edged oil and gas business conservatism, fired his moral concerns, given him a sense of political mission, and given him the energy, force, and staying power to pursue it. McClay goes so far as to admit that Bush's commitment to his evangelical faith has made him more liberal, in a certain sense, than many of his party brethren. This liberalism is not that of the post-New Deal Democratic Party. It is instead one that promotes the individual and is suspicious of hierarchy and tradition. Quote, "Because evangelicalism places such powerful emphasis on the individual act of conversion and insists on the individual's ability to have a personal and unmediated relationship to the deity and to the Holy Scriptures," McClay explains, "it fits well within the American tendency to treat all existing institutions as if their existence and authority were provisional and subordinate." End of quote. These remarks about Bush help to explain some of the anomalies of the current administration, but are especially useful for introducing the idea that the religious right is less conservative than meets the eye. Historical and political analysis since Reagan has tended to foist conservatism of all kinds into the right side of American electoral politics. For evangelicals, this conflation has been deceptive for two reasons. The first has to do with how conservative evangelical faith really is. I do not have time to develop this point, nor is it really germane to my remarks this evening. But let me say, as an aside, that judged by the standards of Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, or historic Protestantism, evangelical Christianity is incredibly novel and in some sense liberal. The second reason why it is deceptive to conflate the faith of evangelicals with American conservatism has to do with several points hinted at in McClay's reflections about Bush. For the sake of brevity, I will comment on three specific tendencies of evangelical faith that have particular bearing on born-again Protestants' tolerance for conservatism. The first is an anti-hierarchical instinct that manifests itself in fundamentally egalitarian ways. Evangelical egalitarianism owes much to the Protestant doctrine of the Bible as the sole rule for faith and life, which manifests itself in marked hostility to church or ministerial authority. All people, evangelicals assume, can read the Bible for themselves and make sense of it. They don't need the instruction or supervision of clergy. As Nathan Hatch well demonstrated in his important book, The Democratization of American Christianity, this conception of the Bible, teamed up with the democratic populism of the early 19th century, gave evangelicals a rigid political philosophy that was inherently distrustful of those in authority. The political theory of revivalism essentially taught that divine authority was good and human authority was inherently bad. This left the individual sovereign, only to be checked by the instruction of Scripture, which quite conveniently the sovereign individual could interpret as he or she needed. Religious forms of evangelical anti-hierarchicalism abound. Simply go to any celebration center that features a form of worship unimaginable to any period or tradition of the Christian past. The political forms of such egalitarian distrust of hierarchy are no less easily discerned among born-again Protestants. A general impatience with the procedures and structures of constitutionalism and federalism is characteristic of this egalitarian disposition. To recognize the authority of local governments, national sovereignty, or the judicial branch of the government is something that conflicts with the moral idealism of evangelicals as well as their anti-formalism. If church offices, creeds, and liturgies are simply man-made devices to restrict access of humble believers to God, the same goes for state officials, constitutions, and procedures of governance. Born-again Protestants might not exactly put it that way, and if asked about the value of the Constitution or the balance of powers or federalism, would express appreciation for the American system of government. But when confronted with specific cases requiring legal discernment and political prudence, evangelicals generally cave on the fine points and go right for the realm of unmediated relations between God and man, where forms and mediation are supposed to be a barrier. Recent debates among evangelicals about illegal immigration are an example. Rather than either looking at the laws governing immigration or even at the socioeconomic circumstances that tempt both Americans to hire illegals and illegals to seek employment in the United States, evangelicals have invariably evaluated the situation as simply a Christian problem of what believers should do for the stranger and alien. Not only do such reactions reflect a confusion of public and private realms in America, but they also do little to encourage appreciation for forms and structures of civil society, or even to recognize the way those patterns of social interaction may reflect, even if in a flawed way, a divine scheme of government. The second tendency of evangelical religion that nurtures ambivalence about conservatism is millennialism. That is, a certain set of convictions about the end of history and the time of Christ's return. Actually, what is far more important about millennialism is not the sequence of events that will precede the second coming, but rather what the present stage of history signifies in the grand scheme of salvation history. To put it simply, what does the present age have to do with the new heavens and new earth taught throughout the Bible? This question has much less to do with America's foreign policy regarding the Middle East than it does with domestic policy. If, as most American Protestants have held, the United States is a special nation in covenant with God, then America has a particular burden to be righteous and to usher in the kingdom of God. This aspect of evangelical devotion directly succumbs to the temptation that Eric Voegelin, the political philosopher, well described when he spoke of immanentizing the eschaton. That is, evangelicals, mainline Protestants were also guilty of this before them, believe in some way that they can establish heaven on earth. Again, they would never put it so crudely if a pollster asked the question in just those words. But their actions and social involvements betray a sense that what will be true of the world to come should also characterize the world here and now. Such millennial impulses, I believe, help to account for the recent evangelical statements about violence, poverty, hunger, war, and the environment. This is not to say that people who are not evangelical favor violence, poverty, hunger, war, and the abuse of the environment. Generally speaking, most of humanity recognizes these aspects of human existence as undesirable and in need of attention. The question instead is one of expectation. Are you willing to live with these hardships as part of a fallen human world, or do you think they can actually be eliminated? To put it another way, are you indignant every time you see human suffering, or are you delighted to see human flourishing because you know suffering is par for the course? Bill McClay, who I quoted earlier, put this feature of evangelicalism well when he said the following, quote, "There is not much of original sin or any other form of Calvinist severity in the current outlook of the Bush administration. That, too, is a reflection of the optimistic character of American evangelicalism and therefore of evangelical conservatism. But conservatism will be like the salt that has lost its savor if it abandons its most fundamental mission, which is to remind us of what Thomas Sowell called the constrained vision of human existence, which sees life as a struggle with invariably mixed outcomes, full of unintended consequences and tragic dilemmas involving hopelessly fallible people, a world in which the legacy of the past is usually more reliable than the projections of the future. Such a vision need not reject the possibility of human progress altogether, which, by the way, has never been characteristic of traditional conservatism either, from Edmund Burke on. But it does suggest that it is sometimes wise to see the hand of providence in our reversals as well as our triumphs." End of quote. This is only to say that in addition to missing the insight of Vogelin on the dangers of immanentizing the eschaton, evangelical millennialism also forgets the teaching of Augustine, who argued that the city of God and the city of man do not correlate, but in fact that divine ways transcend human efforts. The last characteristic that may explain evangelicalism's ambivalent relationship to American conservatism is a form of religious experience that exalts the personal over corporate, the subjective over the objective, feeling over form. This is inherent in the very name born-again Protestantism, a phrase that indicates the importance of a conversion experience, a time of intense spiritual anguish that finds relief in a direct encounter with the divine. Personal relationship with Jesus is one way that evangelicals describe the consequences of this experience. As such, to have Jesus in one's heart is a much more intimate affair than, say, talking about the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. Born-again politics have a special resonance in the age of the politics of identity. For that reason, the rise of the religious right in the age of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation is not accidental. The conversion experience in evangelical conceptions is so existentially profound that it yields a comprehensive identity akin to those supposedly generated by genetics or economic status. This means that born-again Protestants find it impossible to consider that they could ever leave their faith behind when entering the voting booth or holding public office. They are evangelical Christians all the way down. It also means that they tend to evaluate candidates more by character than by policy or philosophy of governance. Think of Billy Graham's naive relationship with Richard Nixon, Bill Hybels feeling Bill Clinton's pain, or James Dobson's endorsement of Harriet Miers. And you have some sense of the way that evangelicals allow personal considerations to cloud more objective considerations about the public good. In this way, the religious right has a tendency to repeat in the political realm the Christian heresy of Donatism. The Donatists were a party in the early church who questioned the validity of sacraments offered by unfaithful priests. Augustine argued against them and established the orthodox view that the sacraments are valid and effective even when administered by corrupt church officers. Evangelical Protestants have trouble agreeing with Augustine either about pastors and priests or about government officials. They tend to believe that a person with a bad character will automatically be a bad politician. As such, evangelical sensitivity to the conversion experience prompts them to vote for a politician with a self-professed integrity rather than one whose policies, no matter what his personal life may be like, will help to cultivate a better, if not a good, society. Let me now conclude with some statement about the future. Here I want to remind you of a piece that New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote about Rick Warren, the pastor of the very successful Baptist church in California, who, while behind the pulpit, wears Hawaiian shirts and wrote the best-selling Purpose-Driven Life. Brooks happened to be at a conference sponsored by the Pew Charitable Trusts and heard Warren as one of the speakers. To Warren's credit, he has taken the profits from his book and not simply bought more merchandise from Tommy Bahamas. He has also established institutions to help those in African countries suffering from AIDS. This led Brooks to write the following, quote, "When I look at the evangelical community, I see a community in the midst of a transformation, branching out beyond the traditional issues of abortion and gay marriage and getting more involved in programs to help the needy. I see Rick Warren, who through his peace initiative is sending thousands of people to Rwanda and other African nations to fight poverty and disease. I see Chuck Colson deeply involved in the Sudan. I see Richard Cizik of the National Association of Evangelicals drawing up a service agenda that goes way beyond the moral turf of Christian conservatives. Brooks goes on. Millions of evangelicals are embarrassed by the people held up by the news media as their spokesmen. Millions of evangelicals feel less represented by the culture war-centered parachurch organizations and better represented by congregational pastors who have a broader range of interests and more passion for mobilizing volunteers to perform service. Millions of evangelicals want leaders who live by faith by serving the poor. End of quote. What Brooks sees may very well be the future of evangelicalism and the American right. It is millions of compassionate evangelicals without much consideration for limited government, legitimate authority, national sovereignty, the conditions that generate financial or social capital, the importance of strong mediating institutions, or the reality of unintended consequences, supporting policies and voting for candidates who will use the resources of the United States government to end human suffering, not only in America, but around the world. That may be an inspiring vision of the future, but it is unclear whether it has much to do with American conservatism. Thank you. Shoot away, if you'd like. I remind you that there are microphones coming, so if you have a question, please use one of those. Yes, sir.
I'm not quite sure I understand. What do you mean with the difference between evangelicals and, for instance, I would call them ecumenicals, compared to the far right? You use the far right, the religious right, and ecumenical or evangelicals. I don't understand the difference, and what denominations of churches would be involved in some of those.
I didn't use the word ecumenical, so I don't know if there are the denominations that are evangelical. That's somewhat of a misconstruction. There are denominations that are members of the National Association of Evangelicals. Some of those denominations left the mainline churches. Maybe that's what you mean by ecumenical. And the mainline churches are, if I say there are mainline churches that are Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, and then I say there are evangelical churches that are Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, well, what's going on? I mean, they're both Baptists, they're both Lutherans, they're both. So one way of trying to discern the difference is to look at the members of the National Association of Evangelicals. Recently in the news, unfortunately, because of Ted Haggard and his difficulties, he was the president of the NAE, or the National Council of Churches, which is the so-called mainline Protestant body, which really is not a factor these days. I mean, it puts out memos that pretty much everybody ignores. I still get emails from them occasionally, but it's really quite something that in the last 50 years, the NAE has outstripped the National Council of Churches. No one would have predicted that. So I don't know if that helps to get an answer to your question, but and it's probably TMI. I mean, way more information than we might need here. But evangelicals are those people who believe in a born-again experience, and you can find them almost anywhere these days, even in the Roman Catholic Church, even in parts of Eastern Orthodoxy. So to talk about denominational identity for evangelicals, this is why I was trying to say something about the disregard for structures and forms means that church identification doesn't matter as much to having a personal relationship with Jesus and having a great knowledge of the Bible. And you can find those people everywhere, probably some even in this room.
But yet evangelicals use evangelicals, far right, and
I use evangelicals and religious right largely synonymously. I don't think that's fair necessarily, but I mean that's the way current political analysis goes. The far right is an older term that hasn't been used quite as much. I mean, at one time, Jerry Falwell would have been considered far right because he identified himself as a fundamentalist. And I had a professor at Harvard back in the early 80s who had this wager with us that in, I think it was like 10 years, nobody would remember Jerry Falwell. Well, he proved to be wrong. But so I think those differences between far right and evangelicals and religious right are less meaningful, especially when it comes to electoral politics when you basically have two choices, Democrats or Republicans. I hope that helps somewhat.
Is to be evangelical is the same thing as being anti-intellectual?
Not necessarily. I do think that the emphasis on experience and the conversion experience can lead evangelicals in that way. And Mark Knoll, whom I quoted earlier today, getting these lectures mixed up in my mind now. A prominent historian, used to be at Wheaton College, now he's moved to Notre Dame. He hasn't converted to Roman Catholicism, but he is teaching at Notre Dame now. Wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and tried to argue that I think the first sentence of the book is the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is no evangelical mind. And part of his book was about trying to understand why there wasn't a vigorous intellectual life among evangelicals. And so in one sense, you could say that the emphasis upon experience among evangelicals does lead to a kind of anti-intellectualism, but it's not necessarily one that's actively cultivated. It's just sort of an implication of other sorts of convictions. Does that help? Maybe you should get the mic again since, sorry. I probably shouldn't ask people.
I was thinking in terms of like evolution, global warming, stem cell research, etc.
Is
that anti-intellectual and also anti-scientific?
I'm not sure why you'd ask whether those things were anti-intellectual, though. I guess that's what I'm having trouble with. I think there are evangelicals who are thinking about these matters, so in that sense, you could classify them as intellectual. But there are also intellectual arguments against government action on these things. So it's competing intellectualisms at that point. Yes.
I was wondering about the role of maybe things that have come to light recently with books such as What's the Matter with Kansas, and also a book that was recently came out by the former deputy director of the Faith-Based Initiative, basically showing how the Bush administration has used the evangelical Christians in order to get elected or to get their people into office, and then to enact policies that don't even represent the Christians who elected them, and that they just kind of use wedge issues and the Faith-Based Initiative as kind of window dressing and appeasement, and then not even following through with like an evangelical agenda. And if that has a role in this, the end of the marriage, as you said.
Right. I haven't seen evangelical reactions yet to that book. I've heard Laura Ingraham and Hugh Hewitt go off on it on their radio shows. And Hewitt would be an evangelical and Laura is not. But with apologies to my dinner companions where this question came up earlier, I think that the answer, and I like my answer from the dinner, so I'll use it again here. I think there's truth somewhere in the middle. Alan Wolfe has a review of that book in a couple of issues ago in the New Republic. And he makes the point that David Quo is the author of that other book who worked in the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. He makes the point that evangelicals are inherently gullible, and this may go back to the earlier question about anti-intellectual. And so that evangelicals are ripe for being abused is part of his point, and he thinks the Quo book actually demonstrates this. So I guess I tend, unless I see direct evidence of it, and I don't circulate in Washington well enough to know people who are actually devising cynical strategies to merely attract evangelicals and then leave them at the altar. I don't necessarily think Republicans are that cynical. I do think that they have an awareness that they need to include certain social issues in their platforms to attract a very important base in their success. And at the same time, I think evangelicals may overestimate how much the administration may actually care about their policies. And so somewhere in the middle is the truth, where evangelicals feel abused, and the Bush administration or people in the Bush administration may see an inherent weakness here that they can use for electoral success. There's probably truth on both sides there. I've only read reviews of the book about Kansas, so I won't really comment about that. Especially since I'm here in Kansas and people seem to know Kansas here better than I do.
I would be interested in your view of the degree to which you feel Christians have a civic responsibility. I mean, you kind of alluded, I think, to it in the Chicago. There was a statement in the Chicago statement, and then another one. I forget the name of it. And
for the health of the nation, maybe.
Right,
yeah,
right. And so, today, what would you say as a theologian about an evangelical Christian in America, their civic responsibility?
As a theologian, which I rarely claim to be, but I know enough to get me in trouble, at least in my denomination, I would say that the Bible teaches that people who have the status of citizens, not every Christian in the early church did, but those who did had some sort of civic responsibility. The question would be what shape that will take, whether it means actually turning out voters on election, and really becoming involved in the political party, or simply voting and picking up the trash in one's neighborhood. There are various ways that we can do it, and I think, unfortunately, so much attention is paid and money spent on national politics, especially the presidential contest, that we tend to think that what happens in Washington is what really matters for citizenship, and I tend to reject that idea, because I think local communities and neighborhoods are very important, especially for the health of our own lives. And so becoming involved in those sorts of community associations can also be a way of doing it, but if it doesn't result in votes for one of the parties, then people tend to think it's not important. And there's a lot of power in Washington. I'm not trying to deny that there is. There's a lot of power in Washington, and so there is also some responsibility that Americans have as being citizens of this country for that power, but that's not the only political game in town, especially not in your town if you don't live in Washington.
I remember reading after the 2004 election that of the voters who voted for Bush, 20% of them self-identified as evangelicals. I just wondered if you think that statistic is accurate.
Yes, I do, although I think it may be, well, I guess initially it strikes me as even low, but it doesn't, so I think it could even go up, but who is to doubt the veracity of polls?
You mentioned that evangelicals place a great deal of emphasis on the personal as opposed to corporate responsibility and actions. Why then would they get involved in liberal programs, social programs, faith-based initiatives with government doing this? Why wouldn't they again rely on the personal effort at, as you mentioned, the local community? It seems to be a contradiction there.
I think two things might account for this. One is by having so much energy drawn in the direction of national politics, it's hard to pull back. I was recently at and I'm not trying to name drop, and many of you may not know who Ron Sider is, so I may not be name dropping, but I was recently at a breakfast with Ron Sider, the person who helped to write the For the Health of the Nation 2005 statement, who is an Anabaptist, pretty pronounced pacifist, and but has emerged as a leader among evangelical, this sort of younger generation. It's hard to call baby boomers young anymore, but and it was amazing that we were trying to talk about basically a philosophy of life and what makes life good, and how much neighborhoods and local communities account for that. And he was all about government policy, turning out the vote, and changing legislation. And I feel like he's been so drawn in that direction and so oriented in that direction that it's hard now for him to back away. So I think that's part of it. So ironically, the legacy of the religious right is now, if the evangelicals are turning left, is to spend increasingly more time on national politics and legislative success. And now that I've answered with the one point, I've forgotten the second point that I was going to make, so I hope that might help explain some of it. Good. I'm finally getting a question from the right, because every question so far, from my perspective, has been from the left. But
from where I'm sitting, it's on the left. Yeah.
Yes.
How do you distinguish between evangelical and fundamentalist?
Well, the one I like to say is the one that usually gets the most laughs, and we'll see if this turns out that way, is that a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's angry. So typically, fundamentalists are regarded as being more doctrinaire and more intolerant, and therefore meaner in some way. And evangelicals are maybe more willing to get along. But 25 years of the religious right has not really confirmed that impression. Everyone is increasingly lumped together as an evangelical, and increasingly evangelicals on the right look mean. So that older quip doesn't make as much sense, and maybe doesn't get as big a laugh as it used to. But the sort of defining moment, if you really want to know for religious historians, is 1957, I believe, or 6, the Billy Graham Crusade in New York City, when Billy Graham used mainline so-called liberal Protestant churches to help recruit for his crusade there. And that's when fundamentalists like Bob Jones disavowed any more involvement with Billy Graham. And that's when you have this rift between evangelicals, Billy Graham, and fundamentalists, people like Bob Jones. But it works more then it made more sense of sort of religious activities and not political ones. So to use that for understanding political differences, I don't think is as helpful.
Good evening. On behalf of the students, I'd really like to thank you for being here tonight. We often don't get to hear the mix of religion and politics, so we're very glad to have you.
Thank you.
I was interested in your historical comments that you made about during the 1960s, some evangelicals feeling like they played more of the role of an obstacle than an ally to the civil rights movement. How would you characterize or predict the future sentiment of evangelicals in response to sexuality, and how they will either feel like, will they lament over the fact that they were not stronger advocates for equal rights for homosexuals, or will they continue on their current course?
That's a really good question. And if I knew the answer, I might be able to make some money. But I guess if the 60s represents, we can learn from history. History doesn't automatically repeat itself. But if that were the case, then I think you could see evangelicals increasingly embracing the idea in some way. It would be very hard for evangelicals, if they are conservative in their reading of Scripture, to endorse gay marriage, or even to tolerate ordination of homosexuals, for instance. Although that's happening. There are evangelicals, at least in some mainline churches, that are sort of living with it, although it's creating a real controversy in the Episcopal Church. David Quo is somewhat interesting in reading this review. I haven't read the book yet. This fellow who worked in the Bush administration. So, a turning point in his life, as I understand it, was he had his girlfriend at college had gotten pregnant, I guess, by him, and he helped her get an abortion, and then he felt guilty about it and switched his convictions and sort of then began to change some of his political convictions. But I guess a lot of this has to do with the lived reality. If you don't have a political philosophy or even a strong theological views, then if you see more shows like Will and Grace and Other forms where it just becomes a little bit more natural. I could easily see evangelicals coming to terms with it in some way, but in the way that they did with civil rights. So it wouldn't surprise me if that happened.
As near as I can tell, you've a little bit overlooked that maybe people like Rick Warren don't represent evangelical movements. They represent a change in evangelical movements. And one thing that would be an illustration would be, it is one thing to go to Africa and help people in Africa. It's another thing entirely to demand that all of you pay for that. And that's something that Rick Warren is doing that the rest of the evangelical movement in the past has not.
I think that's the difference between whether government or private charities would conduct the work, I think, is important. I do think, though, that Warren is more representative than you may allow, and that he can be indicative of a change and representative of the changed evangelicalism, if we can try to square the circle there. Or, I mean, the popularity of his book was staggering, Purpose-Driven Life. I just don't think that you can discount that. But I can also say that recently I was at one of our conferences, ISI conferences, and students, the issue of AIDS in Africa came up, and I think at a certain point, if you begin to involve the churches and younger Christians in those sorts of efforts, and then you calculate and figure out that, wait, the federal government has a lot more money than Rick Warren does, and if they spent that money on concerns in Africa, then you might be a lot more effective. It seems to me that those sorts of private efforts can actually cultivate pressure on government to use taxes for it. So I guess I would disagree with you somewhat in your assertion, but that's what's great about America. We're free to disagree, right?
I wondered if you could comment on the influence of evangelicals in the United States from evangelicals in other parts of the world, numerically, other areas being faster growing evangelical churches.
Right.
And that could come through immigration to this country or just other, the Episcopal Anglican Church has had that sort of influence, but even NGOs that maybe are based in the United States but that are active in crisis areas. So people indigenous to other areas, as well as information that gets back to the United States from other areas, how that you see that playing in American evangelicalism.
I guess the only evidence I see of it right now is in the Episcopal Communion. I think it's also important to keep in mind, though, that a lot of the recent resurgence of evangelicalism, so-called, in what's also called global Christianity in the global South, its origins are largely American. In fact, I gave a lecture earlier today in Topeka, which is one of the sites of the early outpourings of the Spirit for Pentecostalism. Charles Parham, a minister there, and maybe many of you know this history far better than I. But, I mean, and that Pentecostal charismatic form of Protestantism or Christianity is really fueling a lot of the global South. And so I'm not sure yet which way the influence is going. I still tend to think, and this isn't because I'm a fan of it or even a fan of American influence around the world, that there's still a lot of influence by North Americans in those places that are at least more charismatic and Pentecostal. And that in certain cases, which are maybe more the exception, those resources can be used for the advantage of conservatives in America, such as the Episcopal Church. But I'm not sure the direction of influence has changed yet. And the style of worship, as I've even experienced it some time ago, but in Brazil, is still very similar to the sort of contemporary worship that goes on here. And because so much of this kind of Christianity is bound up with popular culture, Christian music industry, radio and television, and because that's one of America's exports, I still think there's a lot of influence of America in those places, more than we sometimes imagine. Yes, ma'am. Oh, well, sorry. There's woman up here.
Since all of us have so few choices politically, would you care to guess where the evangelicals are going to go in, let's say, the next national election?
This isn't going to sound very Christian, but I think it's a real crapshoot, depending on the candidates. So I really have no idea, and so I for one would have never predicted George W. Bush. But I mean, there was a certain, which means to me anyway, that there's a certain kind of dynamics in backroom politics that still go on that lead up through the primaries to certain people emerging, which doesn't seem very democratic because we don't seem to have much of a say, and people with money have more of a say in that process or whatever. And I have just no idea who will emerge from the Democratic and Republican primaries. It doesn't seem like the pundits really have a good idea. There are certain names that they keep talking about, but and the way the Democrats have now changed the primary system.
Any more questions tonight? Join me in thanking Darryl Hart for coming to the University of Kansas. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Lots of new faces. Hope to see you back here in the future. If you're interested in tonight's topic, I think you'd be very interested in a lot of our programs, but I would single out to you one that Stephen Jakes mentioned at the outset. On November 29th, Ryan Sager, author of The Elephant in the Room, which is about the coming battle which he sees for the heart and the soul of the Republican Party. Hope to see you there and at some of our other programs. Thanks for coming out tonight.